Hey guys, tonight, let us take it slow. Dim the lights, fix your pillow into that one shape it never seems to hold for more than 5 minutes, and let us just wander through history together. Nothing urgent, nothing exciting, just a gentle, slightly depressing, slightly absurd story about some of the most overlooked people in world history. Yes, eunuchs, you know. The men who were, let us say, surgically edited, so they could work in royal courts without causing dynastic chaos. Not the happiest career path, but one that managed to exist for, about 3,000 years. Because once kings and emperors discovered the trick of having servants who could never start their own families, they just never stopped. And it's worth saying right from the start, this isn't going to be a horror story. We're not here for medical details. We're here for irony, for the odd way these men who were supposed to be politically harmless ended up running entire empires. They were trusted precisely because they couldn't have children, and yet, that trust often gave them more power than anyone else at court. The result? Some of the most influential, most resented, and frankly, most fascinating figures in history. So tonight, let us float gently into their world. From the palaces of ancient China to the gold-laced corridors of Byzantium, these are the forgotten eunuchs, the guardians, the whisperers, the manipulators, the survivors. And also, let us be honest, some of the pettiest and most entertaining characters in the historical record. We'll start, naturally, in China. Because if there was one place where eunuchs thrived, it was in the Chinese imperial court. They were not just minor servants. They became ministers, generals, admirals, and sometimes the unofficial rulers behind the throne. The Chinese bureaucracy loved rules, rituals, and complicated hierarchies. And into that system, eunuchs slipped perfectly. They could be promoted as high as the emperor liked, because they had no family clan to build a rival power base. At least, that was the theory. In practice, they built factions anyway, just with adopted sons, nephews, and clients instead of bloodlines. Because when humans are told, you can have a dynasty, their first instinct seems to be, well, let us try anyway. The earliest stories of eunuchs in China go back more than 2,000 years, to the Zhou dynasty. By the Han dynasty, around the IND century BC, they were already a regular feature of court life. Officially, their role was simple: they looked after the emperor's harem. And yes, this meant guarding the concubines. Because emperors were always worried that someone else might sneak into the harem and produce a baby with royal blood but inconvenient paternity. If you were a eunuch, you were considered safe. There was no way you could compromise the bloodline. So you got a job that was intimate, trusted, and eventually political. The Han court is full of stories about eunuchs becoming too powerful. Imagine being a Confucian scholar. You've spent decades memorizing ancient texts, practicing calligraphy, and learning all the right ceremonial bows. Then along comes a eunuch with none of that training, who whispers in the emperor's ear and gets promoted over you. It must have been infuriating. And indeed, the official histories written by those same scholars are full of venom about eunuchs. They were called greedy, corrupt, manipulative, which, to be fair, some of them were. But also, it is hard not to see the resentment peeking through the text. One famous case was Zhao Gao, who lived earlier, during the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BC. He is remembered as one of the most notorious manipulators in Chinese history. Zhao Gao was supposed to be a tutor for the royal family. Instead, when the emperor died, he helped cover it up, manipulated the succession, and basically controlled the young new emperor. It is like having your high school math teacher suddenly run the country, except with far more sinister results. And of course, there is the famous calling a deer a horse incident. Zhao Gao literally brought a deer into the throne room and told the emperor, "Look at this horse." When the emperor hesitated, Zhao Gao turned to the courtiers. "What do you see?" Some said, carefully, "Well, it looks like a horse to me." Others, perhaps more honest, said, "That is a deer." And the ones who said deer were executed. Because nothing builds loyalty like making everyone lie to your face about basic animal identification. It is ridiculous, yes, but it also shows how far eunuchs could go in controlling court politics. Fast forward a few centuries, and things had only escalated. By the late Han Dynasty, eunuchs had formed entire factions at court. They were the ones managing access to the emperor, deciding which petitions he saw, and which ones mysteriously got lost. This is the universal law of bureaucracy. Whoever controls the paperwork controls the power. And eunuchs were masters of paperwork, of course. This led to endless complaints from officials. There are stories of eunuchs selling government posts, embezzling money from the treasury, and living in luxury while the empire crumbled around them. One emperor, frustrated by their dominance, ordered a mass purge of eunuchs. Thousands were executed, and for a short while, the Confucian officials celebrated. Until, inevitably, new eunuchs rose to take their place. Because emperors still needed someone they could trust. And trust, in imperial courts, was always in short supply. Let us float forward to the Ming Dynasty, many centuries later. By then, eunuchs had become a permanent institution. They had their own bureaucracy, their own schools, and their own secret police. Yes, a secret police force run entirely by eunuchs. That's how much power they had. It's almost cartoonish. Imagine James Bond, but with a palace servant background and a lifelong grudge against Confucian scholars. One of the most famous Ming eunuchs was Zheng He. Now, Zheng He is one of those rare figures who gets remembered fondly. He wasn't just a court schemer. He was an admiral, and not just of any navy, but of the largest fleet in the world at the time. In the early 1400s, he led 7 massive voyages across the Indian Ocean. His ships were called treasure ships, and they were huge, some said to be 400 feet long, far bigger than any seen in Europe. He sailed to India, Arabia, and East Africa, bringing back exotic animals and gifts. The emperor was delighted when Zheng He returned with a giraffe, because he thought it might be a mythical creature called a qilin, which, honestly, is one of the more charming misunderstandings in history. Imagine a tired giraffe, dragged across the sea, standing in a Chinese palace while everyone insists it's a dragon horse from legend. But Zheng He's voyages weren't universally loved. The Confucian bureaucrats hated them. They thought he was wasting money, showing off, and distracting the empire from more important internal matters. And since the Confucians were the ones writing the history books, their disapproval meant Zheng He's achievements were downplayed for centuries. Still, he remains one of the most extraordinary eunuchs in history, a man who, despite his status, became the face of China's global ambitions. But let us not give the impression that all eunuchs were grand admirals or scheming politicians. Most of them lived quieter, lonelier lives. Many were slaves, recruited as boys, sometimes sold by desperate parents, sometimes taken as prisoners of war. The surgery itself was dangerous, and many didn't survive. Those who did were often trapped in a system that treated them as useful tools but rarely as full human beings. And yet, within that system, they carved out spaces for themselves. Some became collectors of art, patrons of temples, or advisors who genuinely tried to steer their emperors wisely. Others fell into corruption, greed, and factional infighting. In other words, they were just like everyone else in power, only with a very different entry requirement. Now let us drift westward, to the Byzantine Empire. Because if any civilization rivaled China in its love of eunuchs, it was Byzantium. The Byzantine court was a maze of ceremonies, rituals, and elaborate titles. And eunuchs fit neatly into this system. They were seen as ideal palace officials, loyal, safe, and, importantly, barred from the throne themselves. This made them perfect middlemen between the emperor and the rest of the aristocracy. Some Byzantine eunuchs became incredibly powerful. They ran the treasury, oversaw the imperial household, and even led armies. Yes, armies. Which brings us to Narses, a eunuch general in the 11th century. Narses served under Emperor Justinian, the same emperor who built the Hagia Sophia and bankrupted the empire in the process. Despite his physical condition, Narses was appointed to lead military campaigns. And surprisingly, he was good at it. He defeated the Ostrogoths in Italy and reasserted Byzantine control over the peninsula. Not bad for someone who was supposed to be a harmless court functionary. The Byzantines also had a peculiar fascination with the appearance of eunuchs. They often described them as androgynous, with high voices and delicate features. In an empire obsessed with religious symbolism, eunuchs sometimes came to be seen as almost angelic beings who stood outside normal human categories of male and female, which, depending on how you look at it, was either strangely empowering or just another way of stripping them of humanity. So what do we make of all this? Eunuchs were supposed to be safe. They couldn't produce heirs, so they couldn't threaten dynasties. And yet, time after time, they found ways to accumulate power. They controlled access to rulers, they ran finances, they commanded armies, they sailed fleets. They were central to the functioning of courts from China to Byzantium, from Persia to the Ottoman Empire. And still, they were often forgotten in the way history is told. Maybe because their existence makes us uncomfortable. Maybe because they don't fit neatly into our usual categories of kings, queens, and generals. Or maybe because the scholars who wrote the histories really didn't like being outshone by them. Either way, their lives tell us something about how power works. It is not always about bloodlines, or swords, or charisma. Sometimes it is about being close to the throne. Sometimes it is about controlling the paperwork. And sometimes it is about having nothing else left to lose. So tonight, as we move forward, we float into other courts where eunuchs played their part. To the Ottoman Empire, where they guarded the harem and became kingmakers in their own right. To Renaissance Europe, where castrati sang angelic hymns in cathedrals while everyone politely ignored how they got their voices. And maybe by the end, we see that eunuchs were never really forgotten at all. They were just written out of the story. But history, as usual, refuses to forget them completely.